Welcome to a nightmare that began on an ordinary day in a town that had forgotten how to be dry. For 3 weeks rain had fallen on Havenwood Creek. It was not a violent, thunderous rain, but a quiet, persistent, maddening drizzle that soaked the world in a uniform shade of grey. The ground, already saturated, could take no more. The creek that gave the town its name had swollen into a sullen brown river, swallowing its banks and creeping into the yards of the houses on Water Street. A perpetual mist clung to the pine-forested hills that cupped the town, blurring the edges of the world until it felt like they were living at the bottom of a murky aquarium. Elias Thorne felt it in his bones. The dampness was a physical presence, a cold, heavy blanket that seeped through the walls of his great-uncle's old house. He had been here for 6 months, sorting through the chaotic legacy of a man he barely knew, a reclusive academic who had died and left Elias as his only living relative and therefore his sole heir. The house was a library of esoteric and forgotten histories, a labyrinth of paper and dust. Elias, an archivist by trade, should have been in heaven. Instead, he felt like a prisoner. The house stood on a rise at the edge of town, just before the woods began in earnest. It was old, built from the dark, heavy timber of the hills themselves, and it groaned and settled around him like a sleeping beast. The rain drummed a ceaseless, hypnotic rhythm on the roof, a sound that had become the soundtrack to his life, a constant low-level hum of anxiety. On this particular Tuesday, the anxiety sharpened. It began with the power flickering out for the 3rd time that week. Elias sighed, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, and lit one of the oil lamps his great-uncle had kept in every room. The flame cast long, dancing shadows, turning the stacks of books into menacing, monolithic shapes. He needed supplies, coffee, lamp oil, something that had not come out of a can. The thought of venturing into the drowned town was deeply unappealing, but the thought of another day without caffeine was worse. He pulled on a heavy, waxed jacket, grabbed a sturdy walking stick his great-uncle had favored, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick and heavy, tasting of wet earth and decaying leaves. The rain was not falling so much as hanging in the air, a visible, breathing mist. The path down to the town was a treacherous stream of mud, and Elias picked his way down carefully, his boots making obscene sucking sounds with every step. The town of Havenwood Creek was in a state of quiet misery. Sandbags, dark and sodden, lined the doors of the shops on Main Street. A few people trudged through the ankle-deep water that covered the sidewalks, their faces grim and pale under the grey sky. There was a temporary, dreamlike quality to the scene, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting. He pushed open the door to the general store, a small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerless jingle. The store was dim, lit by a few battery-powered lanterns. Silas, the proprietor, a man whose face seemed to be permanently etched with worry lines, was leaning on the counter, staring out at the rain. "Morning," Silas said, his voice flat. "Power is out on your hill too?" "Since dawn," Elias replied, stamping mud from his boots. "Just need the essentials." He gathered his items, the silence in the store broken only by the drip of water from a leak in the ceiling into a plastic bucket. Sheriff Brody was there too, nursing a cup of coffee near the back. Brody was a big man, his uniform straining at the seams, a symbol of order in a world that was slowly dissolving. "This rain, it is not natural," Silas said suddenly, his voice low. He was not looking at Elias, but at the streaked window. My granddaddy used to talk about it, the long rain. It comes every 50 years or so. It stays for a month. He said it changes things. Sheriff Brody snorted. It changes things into a flooded mess, Silas. That is what it does. Do not go spooking yourself with old stories. He said things come with the rain, Silas insisted, his eyes wide. Things from the woods, things that like the dark and the wet. Elias, who had spent the last 6 months cataloguing his great-uncle's collection of local folklore, felt a small, cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had read similar accounts, vague, rambling diary entries from the 19th century, stories of livestock disappearing, of people going mad, of a strange whistling sound heard in the woods during a month-long rain. He had dismissed them as the superstitions of isolated, weather-beaten pioneers. That is enough, Silas, Brody said, his voice hard. People are on edge. No need to make it worse. Silas fell silent, but he kept glancing nervously at the window. Elias paid for his things and was about to leave when the door swung open again. It was Martha, who lived in a small cabin a few miles deeper in the woods than Elias. Her face was ashen, her eyes wild with a terror that was stark and real. "It took my dog," she gasped, her hands twisting the fabric of her coat. "Right from the yard. I heard him yelp, just once. When I looked out, he was just gone." "A coyote, probably," Brody said, his voice calm and reasonable, but his eyes were sharp. "They get bold when they are hungry." "It was not a coyote," Martha whispered, shaking her head. "There were tracks in the mud. They were not paw prints. They were long, thin, like someone dragged a stick through the yard, and they went right to the edge of the creek." A heavy silence fell over the store. The drip from the ceiling seemed to grow louder. The long rain. Things that come with the rain. The cold knot in Elias's stomach became a fist of ice. He had seen tracks like that this morning on the path from his house. He had assumed they were from a fallen branch, dragged by the runoff. "Go home," Brody said, his voice softer now. "Lock your door. I will come by and take a look when I can." She nodded, though she did not look convinced, and shuffled back out into the grey day. "You too, Silas," Brody said, his gaze sweeping the store. "Close up early. Go home. Lock your door. And keep your mouth shut about your granddaddy's stories." The sheriff's words were an order, and the easy-going atmosphere of the store had evaporated, replaced by a tense, unspoken fear. Elias grabbed his bag of supplies and left, the bell on the door sounding like a funeral chime. The walk back to the house was different. The familiar path now seemed alien, menacing. Every shadow in the woods seemed to hold a lurking shape. The mist-shrouded pines were no longer just trees. They were silent, watching sentinels. The rain, which he had begun to tune out, was now an active, malevolent presence, whispering secrets he did not want to hear. When he reached the house, he noticed something was wrong. The front door, which he was certain he had locked, was slightly ajar. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He pushed the door open slowly. The hallway was dark and silent. Nothing seemed out of place. He called out, his voice a weak croak. "Hello." Only the sound of the rain answered. He walked through the downstairs rooms, his walking stick held out in front of him like a blind man's cane. The kitchen was empty. The living room, with its cold fireplace, was undisturbed. He checked the study, the room where he spent most of his time, the room that housed his great-uncle's most precious and disturbing books. Everything was as he had left it, except for one thing. A book was lying open on the floor. It was a thick, leather-bound volume with no title on its spine. A personal journal his great-uncle had kept. Elias had set it aside, meaning to read it last, a final window into the mind of the man. It was open to a page near the middle. A single sentence was underlined in a shaky, spidery hand. "They cannot cross running water, but God help us, this whole damned world is standing still." Elias stared at the sentence, the words seeming to burn themselves into his brain. He had not left this book on the floor. He was meticulous, organized. He would never leave a valuable book lying open. Someone had been in the house, someone who had read this passage. Or a more chilling thought occurred to him, someone who had left it for him to read. He slowly closed the journal and placed it on the desk. He turned to leave the room, his mind racing, and as he did, his eyes fell on the window. He saw the handprint. It was on the outside of the glass, a long, thin, 5-fingered print, smeared in the grime and the constant moisture. But the fingers were wrong. They were too long, far too long, and slender to be human. They looked like the delicate, bony fingers of a skeleton, but they had left a greasy, almost translucent smear on the pane. The print was high up on the window, higher than a normal person could reach without standing on something. Elias backed away from the window, a low moan escaping his lips. Martha's words came back to him, long, thin. Silas's words, things that come with the rain. He turned and fled the study, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. He ran to the front door of the house and shot the deadbolt, his hands trembling. He did the same to the back door. He went through the ground floor, room by room, checking every window, making sure they were locked, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. As night fell, a true, deep, starless night, the rain intensified, the drumming on the roof becoming a roar. The power did not return. Elias sat in the living room, in a single pool of wavering lamplight, the rest of the house a sea of menacing shadows. He had built a fire in the hearth, but its warmth could not reach the chill that had settled deep inside him. He thought he was going mad. He was overreacting to a series of coincidences. A strange track, a lost dog, an open door, a smear on a window. It could all be explained away. However, he could not shake the feeling of being watched, a primal, chilling certainty that there was something outside, in the rain, waiting. Just after midnight, the sound began. It was a faint, high-pitched, whistling sound. It seemed to come from the woods, a thin, reedy note that rose and fell with an unnatural cadence. It was not the wind. It was not an animal. It was a sound that scraped along the edges of his hearing, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had read about this, the old diaries, a strange, whistling sound heard in the woods. He got up and went to the window, his fear a cold, hard lump in his throat. He peered out into the blackness, but he could see nothing but the rain, a solid, moving wall of water in the lamplight. The whistling grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from the edge of his yard now. It was no longer a single note. There was more than one, a chorus of them, a discordant, alien harmony that made his teeth ache. Then, a flash of lightning split the sky, a rare occurrence in this gentle, persistent storm. For a single, bleached white second, the yard was illuminated as bright as day. He saw them. There were 3 of them. They were standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the dripping pines. The figures were impossibly tall and thin, their bodies little more than skeletal frames, draped in what looked like wet grey rags. Their limbs were too long, and their joints were bending at sickening, unnatural angles. Their heads were smooth, pale and featureless, like river stones worn clean by 1,000 years of current. They had no eyes, no mouths, and no faces at all. The figures were just standing there, in the pouring rain, their blank, terrible heads all tilted towards his house. The lightning faded, plunging the world back into darkness, but the image was burned onto the back of Elias's eyes. The whistling continued, a triumphant, hunting call. They knew he had seen them. They were here, the things that came with the rain. He stumbled back from the window, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. He was trapped. The town was a mile of mud and darkness away, and even if he could reach it, what then? Who would believe him? Brody with his stubborn rationality, Silas with his half-forgotten ghost stories. He thought of the journal. The book left open on the floor. It was a message. It was a warning. He ran back into the study, the whistling seeming to mock him from outside the walls. He snatched the heavy journal from the desk. He had to know. He had to understand what his great-uncle had been so afraid of, what he had spent his life studying in this lonely house on the hill. The house groaned around him. The rain beat against the glass. The whistling grew louder, a circle of sound that was slowly tightening around him. He was alone, utterly and completely alone with the rain and whatever it had brought with it. The silence in the house was a fragile, brittle thing. Elias had retreated to the study, the room that felt most like a fortress, and barricaded the door with a heavy oak armchair. He sat at his great-uncle's desk, the single oil lamp casting a pool of nervous golden light on the open journal. Outside the whistling had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was an expectant silence, a predator's silence. He could feel them out there in the drowning dark, watching, waiting. His hands trembled as he turned the brittle, yellowed pages of the journal. His great-uncle's handwriting was a difficult scrawl, the frantic scratching of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. The early entries were academic and detached, meticulous notes on local weather patterns, historical accounts of floods, and dismissive analyses of the very folklore that Elias now knew to be terrifyingly real. October 12, 1975. Another local has repeated the tale of the gutter men, as his grandfather called them, an amusingly visceral name. The stories are always the same. A long period of rain, strange tracks, missing animals, a whistling sound. The creatures are described as tall, pale, and faceless. Classic bog-standard boogeymen, a manifestation of the fear of the unknown, of the oppressive, claustrophobic nature of these isolated hollows. The human mind craves patterns, and when it finds none, it invents monsters. Elias felt a cold sweat on his brow. Gutter men. The name was crude, but horribly apt. He had seen them. They were not an invention. He read on, his eyes scanning the pages, searching for a shift in his great-uncle's tone. It came a decade later. The academic detachment began to fray, replaced by a thread of unease, then outright obsession. May 3rd, 1985. The rain has lasted for 2 weeks now. The old-timers in town are growing quiet, watchful. I find their superstitious fear contagious. I have begun to document the rainfall with more rigor. There is a cyclical pattern, I am sure of it. Approximately every 40 to 50 years, the rainfall in this specific region exceeds all predictable models for a period of roughly 1 month. The long rain, as Silas's grandfather called it, is a scientifically fascinating anomaly. May 17th, 1985. I saw something in the woods today. I am a man of science, of reason. I must believe it was a trick of the light, the mist playing on a rotted stump. But it was tall and pale. I felt observed. For the first time in my life, I ran back to the house and bolted the door. The entries became more frequent, more frantic. The careful script devolved into a desperate scrawl. May 21st, 1985. The whistling has started. It is exactly as the stories described. A high, thin sound. I cannot pinpoint its origin. It seems to come from everywhere at once. I have reinforced the locks on the windows. I am sleeping in the study, away from the large bedroom windows. I am not sleeping much at all. May 24th, 1985. They came to the house last night. I saw them in a lightning flash, just as I did, 3 of them. They did not try the doors or windows. They simply stood in the yard and watched. Their featureless faces are a canvas onto which the mind projects its deepest horrors. I now understand why the early accounts are so filled with madness. To be seen by something that has no eyes is a uniquely unnerving experience. I have begun to research countermeasures mentioned in the folklore. Salt, iron, running water, salt. Elias's mind seized on the word. He had a large bag of rock salt in the pantry for the winter ice he now knew would never be as dangerous as this rain. It seemed like such a flimsy, pathetic defense against the skeletal horrors he had seen. He forced himself to keep reading, his own fear a cold echo of the terror bleeding from the pages. May 28th, 1985. The rain stopped this morning as suddenly as it began. I ventured out at midday. The tracks are everywhere. The long, thin gouges in the mud. And by the woods where they stood, the ground is covered in a strange, greasy, black slime. It smells of river mud and ozone. It does not wash away. I have taken samples. When I returned, I found a smear on the window pane, a handprint. The fingers are impossibly long. One of them got close. It touched my house. The thought makes my skin crawl. They are gone for now, but they will be back. They always come back with the rain. I have 40 years, perhaps 50, to prepare. The rest of the journal was a descent into a hermetic, paranoid existence. It was filled with detailed diagrams of the house, plans for reinforcement, notes on the chemical composition of the slime, and increasingly wild theories about what the gutter men were. Are they biological, an undocumented species that enters a state of estivation in the dry years? Or are they something else, something elemental? The stories say they are born of the rain, of the mud, that they cannot exist without the constant moisture. When the rain stops, they simply dissolve. This seems fanciful, but then everything about them is fanciful. They are an affront to logic. Elias slammed the journal shut. His head was spinning. He felt a strange, desperate kinship with the lonely, terrified man who had written these words. His great-uncle had not been a mad recluse. He had been a watchman, a sentinel, standing guard against a horror he could not prove and no one would believe. And now, the watch had fallen to him. He had to get the salt. The pantry was at the back of the house, through the kitchen. The thought of leaving the relative safety of the study was terrifying. The house was full of noises he had never noticed before. The groan of the timbers, the rattle of a loose window frame, the maddening drip of a leak he could not place. Every sound could be them. He took the lamp, the iron poker from the fireplace, and slowly, cautiously, removed the armchair from in front of the door. He opened it a crack and peered into the hallway. Darkness, silence. He took a deep breath and stepped out, pulling the study door closed behind him. The journey through his own home was a nightmare trek through enemy territory. The floorboards creaked under his weight, each sound a potential announcement of his position. The shadows thrown by his lamp writhed and danced, creating monsters in every corner. He reached the kitchen, his heart hammering. The window over the sink was a square of pure blackness. He could feel eyes on his back. He did not dare look. He found the salt in the pantry, a heavy canvas bag. It was more than he had hoped for. He hefted it onto his shoulder, the poker still gripped tight in his other hand, and turned to go back. That is when he heard it, a soft, wet, scraping sound. It was coming from the back door. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. The sound came again, scrahe-pay. It was the sound of something sharp and thin being dragged across the wood, a finger, a claw. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide in the wavering lamplight. It knew he was there. It was testing the door. Then came a soft thump, and another thump, 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 thump. Not a violent pounding, but a gentle, inquisitive tapping, as if a bird were pecking at the wood, or a long, bony finger. He had to get back to the study. He turned and fled, not daring to look behind him. He ran through the dark house, the heavy bag of salt bouncing on his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He burst back into the study. slammed the door, and shoved the armchair back against it, his body trembling. He was safe. For now. But they were no longer content to wait in the woods. They were at his doors, at his windows. They were testing his defenses. He leaned against the barricaded door, trying to catch his breath. His eyes fell on the wall next to him. He saw the dark stain. It was a patch of dampness on the old wallpaper, a spot he had never noticed before. It was near the ceiling, in the corner of the room. As he watched, a single, thick, dark drop of liquid oozed from the plaster and dripped slowly down the wall, leaving a greasy black trail behind it. The slime, the ichor his great-uncle had written about. It does not wash away. He looked up. The stain was spreading from the corner, a slow, inexorable bleed. The sound he had been hearing, the maddening drip, it was not a leak from the rain. It was this foul, unnatural substance seeping into his home. But how? The wall was an interior wall. There was no way for the rain to get in there, unless it was not coming from outside, unless it was coming from inside the walls. The scraping at the back door had stopped. The tapping was gone. The house was silent again, save for the roar of the rain and the new, terrible sound of that slow, viscous drip. Drip, drip, drip. It was like a countdown. Elias looked at the bag of salt, then at the single, vulnerable window in the study. He had to create a barrier. He tore open the bag with shaking hands and began to pour a thick, unbroken line of the coarse white crystals along the windowsill. He did the same across the threshold of the door, behind the armchair, a circle of protection. As he worked, a new sound began, the whistling. It was back, but it was different this time. It was not coming from the woods. It was coming from the front of the house, a single, high, thin note. Then a sudden, explosive bang that made him cry out and drop the bag of salt. It was the sound of the heavy brass door knocker on the front door being struck with tremendous force. Bang, 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 bang. A frantic, desperate, human rhythm. And then a voice he recognized. Elias, open the door. For God's sake, let me in. It is Brody. Sheriff Brody. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He was not alone. Brody was here. Help was here. He scrambled to his feet, ready to run to the door, to slide the bolt, to find safety in the presence of another human being. But then his great-uncle's words, from a frantic entry near the end of the journal, echoed in his mind. They are clever. They can mimic sounds. The cry of a lost child, the bark of a dog. Do not trust your ears. Trust the salt. Trust the iron. Do not for any reason open the door. The pounding on the door was insistent and desperate. Brody's voice was raw with what sounded like genuine terror. Elias stood paralyzed between the door to the study and the promise of salvation. He had to choose. He knew with a sickening heart-stopping certainty that the wrong choice would be his last. He had to get to the front door. He had to see. He had to know what his great-uncle knew. He had to read the journal. "Please, Elias, let me in." The voice was a raw wound in the sudden, oppressive silence of the house. It was Sheriff Brody's voice, the same gravelly baritone, the same undertone of authority, now shredded by terror. Elias's heart screamed at him to run to the door, to slide the bolt, to find solace in the fact that he was not alone. The man outside was a symbol of order in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He was safety, he was help, but his great-uncle's words were a cold hand on his shoulder. "They will try to trick you. They can mimic sounds." He stood, paralyzed, in the center of the study, the heavy canvas bag of salt a dead weight in his hand. The pounding on the door was frantic, a desperate, human rhythm. He could almost feel the vibrations through the soles of his shoes. "They are coming back. I can hear them in the woods. That whistling sound. You have got to let me in." The whistling sound. The minister's diary had mentioned it. A high, thin whistle, like wind through a crack in a door. The detail was perfect. Too perfect. It was a detail designed to convince him, to play on the very knowledge he had just acquired. Or it was the genuine terror of a man who had heard it for himself. He had to know. He could not live with the uncertainty. He could not bear the thought of leaving a man to die on his doorstep. But he could not risk opening the door. He forced his legs to move, his feet shuffling on the floorboards. He walked into the hall, his eyes fixed on the sturdy oak door. There was a small peephole, a brass fixture his great-uncle must have installed. He had never used it before. He put his eye to the cold metal and peered through. He saw nothing. The lens was smeared with the same greasy, opaque slime that covered the windows, blurring the outside world into a distorted, wavering mess of grey and green. He could not see a face. He could not see a uniform. He could not even see the porch. "Brody," Elias called out, his voice a dry croak. It sounded thin and weak against the solid wood of the door. The pounding stopped instantly. "Elias." "Thank God. Open the door, man. There is no time." "I cannot see you, Sheriff. The peephole is covered in something." There was a pause, a silence that stretched for a few heartbeats, a void in the man's frantic pleading. When the voice came again, it was tight with strained patience. "It is the damn rain, son. Everything is covered in mud and filth. Just open the door. We can barricade it together. Do not listen. Tell me something, Sheriff," Elias said, pressing his ear against the door. He could feel the deep, damp chill of the wood. Back at the store. "What did you tell Silas to do?" Another pause, longer this time. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of a man catching his breath. It was the silence of a predator, listening. "What the hell are you talking about?" The voice of Brody finally boomed, a note of angry disbelief in it. "People are dying out here, and you are asking me riddles." I told him to go home. What else would I tell him? It was the right answer. It was exactly what Brody had said. A wave of shame and relief washed over Elias. He was being paranoid. This was a real man, a terrified man, and he was leaving him outside. Elias reached for the deadbolt, his fingers trembling, and then he stopped. His great-uncle's warning was a physical barrier. He thought back to the scene in the store, the anger in Brody's voice, the exact words, "Go home, lock your door, and keep your mouth shut." "What else?" Elias pressed, his own voice barely a whisper. "What were your exact words?" The silence that followed was absolute. The rain seemed to fade. The wind died. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Elias could hear the blood roaring in his ears. He waited. 1 second. 2. 3. The voice that finally answered was not Sheriff Brody's. It was a low, wet, guttural sound, like mud bubbling up from a deep spring. A chuckle, a horrifying, inhuman chuckle that seemed to come from the very wood of the door, from the air around him. Then the voice came, a sibilant, mocking whisper that had nothing to do with the sheriff's baritone. "Clever little archivist," it hissed. "Clever little mouse in its box." The blood in Elias's veins turned to ice. He stumbled back from the door, his breath catching in a silent scream. The heavy human pounding was replaced by the familiar sharp, incisive scratching. Not one set of claws, dozens. It sounded like a nest of rats trying to chew their way through the oak. The door vibrated with the furious, frantic noise. Then came the whistling, a high, thin, reedy sound that pierced through the walls, through his skull, a sound that resonated in the bones of his teeth. It was a discordant, alien melody, and it was coming from all around the house at once. He turned and ran. He fled back to the study, slamming the door behind him, as if that would offer any protection. He leaned against it, his body racked with tremors, his mind a howling void of terror. It had mimicked him. It had almost succeeded. He thought of his hand on the deadbolt, how close he had been. He would have opened the door and he would have been face to face with that thing from the lightning flash. The scratching at the front door stopped. The whistling continued, a constant, nerve-shredding dirge. He had to move. He had to do something. The salt, the journal. He grabbed the bag of salt and his great-uncle's journal from the floor. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold them. Lay the salt across every threshold, every windowsill. It was his only chance. He started with the study. He tore open the canvas pouch and began pouring a thick, unbroken line of the coarse white crystals along the base of the window. His breath came in ragged gasps. As he worked, he could hear them outside. A soft, wet, slithering sound in the mud. They were circling the house, their terrible whistling the only announcement of their presence. He finished with the window and moved to the study door, pouring a line across the threshold into the hallway. A barrier, a line of defense. He moved into the living room, the faint glow from the fireplace embers providing a desperate, flickering light. The whistling seemed to get louder as he approached the large bay window. He pulled back the curtains again. In the miserable grey light of the perpetual dusk, he could see them. There were 3 of them, They stood in the ruined yard, motionless, like grotesque statues carved from river clay and dead branches. They were impossibly tall and thin, their limbs too long, their joints bending at unnatural angles. Their smooth, pale, featureless heads were all tilted towards the house, towards him. They were watching him work. They knew what he was doing. One of them took a step. It did not walk like a human. Its long, stick-like leg moved with a slow, disjointed grace. Its foot, a sharpened, stake-like point, sinking deep into the mud. It left one of the long, thin gouges he had seen that morning. It raised a long, spindly arm and pointed a single, needle-sharp finger directly at him. The whistling intensified, focusing on him, a physical pressure against the glass. Elias dropped to his knees, his hands trembling, and poured the salt along the entire length of the wide windowsill. He did not care that they were watching. He poured a thick, generous line, a white wall of hope against the encroaching nightmare. He scrambled to the front door, the scratching still fresh in his memory, and poured a heavy line across that threshold, the salt crunching under his feet. The back door, the kitchen window, every single point of entry on the ground floor. He used nearly half the bag. When he was done, the ground floor of the house was a fortress, each room sealed off from the next, the entire structure sealed off from the outside world. He felt a sliver of security. The old tales were clear. The salt burns them. He stumbled back into the living room and sank into the armchair, his body screaming with exhaustion and adrenaline. He needed a better light. He needed to keep the fire going. He spent the next hour gathering all the oil lamps from around the house, filling them, trimming their wicks. He piled logs beside the fireplace until they reached his waist. The house became a beacon of golden light against the ever-darkening storm, which was beginning to build again. The drizzle was thickening back into a steady, hard rain. As he worked, he noticed things his great-uncle had done. The windows did not just have standard locks. There were heavy iron bolts drilled into the frames. The cellar door in the kitchen was banded with strips of steel. He went down the rickety stairs, lamp held high. The small, ground-level windows of the cellar were bricked in from the inside. His great-uncle had not just studied the long rain, he had lived in fear of it. He had spent years turning this house into a sanctuary. Elias went back upstairs, feeling a strange kinship with the dead, reclusive man. He had not been paranoid. He had been a watchman. The dripping sound started again. It was not just in the study wall anymore. It was in the hallway. It was in the hallway. It was in the kitchen. A slow, thick, viscous thump-thump, like the house was bleeding internally. The sound was maddening, a constant reminder that even with the salt, he was not entirely safe. Something was seeping in. As true night fell, the rain returned to its former fury, a solid, roaring curtain of water. The whistling outside started again, a chorus of alien flutes that seemed to come from every direction at once. Elias sat by the fire, the iron poker in his lap, his great-uncle's journal open on his knees. He read, trying to find more information, another clue, anything that could help him survive. He found a passage he had missed before, in an entry from 40 years ago, when his great-uncle was just a boy. They cannot cross the salt, but they are not fools. I saw one last night, from my bedroom window. It was carrying a long, flat piece of slate, holding it like a shield. It tried to lay it over the salt line my father had poured on the porch. The slate smoked where it touched the salt, and the creature dropped it, letting out that terrible whistle. It retreated, but I saw the intelligence in the act. They learn, they adapt. The words sent a fresh chill through him. They learn. A loud crack from the front of the house made him leap to his feet. It sounded like a rock hitting the wall, then another against the side of the house, and another. He ran to the living room window and peered through a small gap in the curtains. The three figures were still there, but they were no longer still. They were moving, gathering rocks and heavy mud-soaked clods of earth from the yard and hurling them at the house. The projectiles struck the wooden siding with dull, heavy thuds. They were not trying to break the windows. Not yet. They were testing the walls. Or they were angry. Then the attack changed. One of them, taller than the others, strode to the edge of the woods and returned, dragging something behind it. It was a log, a thick, heavy piece of pine, at least 10 feet long. The three of them gathered around it. They lifted it, their long, spindly limbs surprisingly strong. They held it pointed at the house, at the living room wall just to the right of the bay window. Elias's mind went blank with a new, more profound terror. They were going to ram the wall. He backed away from the window, his eyes wide. The salt was useless if they could simply tear the house down around him. He listened, his entire body a single taut nerve. He heard them grunt, a series of low, wet, guttural sounds. Thump. The first impact was jarring. The whole house shuddered. A picture on the far wall, a faded print of a ship at sea, fell to the floor with a crash of broken glass. The sound from outside was sickening, a dull, wet crunch of wood and plaster. Thump. Closer this time, louder. Elias stared at the wall. A thin, horizontal crack appeared in the plaster, a spiderweb of white dust spreading from it. He could hear the wood of the exterior wall groaning in protest. They were going to break through. He was in a wooden box, and they were trying to smash it open. Thump. More plaster fell. The crack widened. He could see the dark lath behind it. He was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The cellar was a bricked-in tomb. The upstairs offered no escape. Thump. A large piece of plaster broke away and shattered on the floor. The wall bowed inwards. He could hear the wood splintering, the nails shrieking as they were torn from their moorings. They were going to get in. They were going to get in now. Elias's eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, a defense, an escape that did not exist. His gaze fell on the fireplace, on the roaring, spitting inferno he had built, and then on the oil lamps he had gathered, their golden flames burning steadily on the mantelpiece. An idea, born of sheer animal desperation, exploded in his mind. It was insane. It was suicidal. It might be his only chance. He grabbed one of the oil lamps, the glass hot to the touch. With a shaking hand, he ripped a strip of fabric from the bottom of the velvet curtains. Outside, the creatures grunted in unison, preparing for another strike. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the splintering wall. He looked at the fire. The salt could not save him. The house could not save him. He had to make them stop. He had to make them afraid. Thump! The wall gave way. A huge, jagged hole 3 feet wide burst open, showering the room with splinters and dust. Through the hole in the churning, rain-lashed darkness, he could see one of them. A smooth, pale, featureless face peering into his home. Time shattered into 1,000,000 sharp-edged seconds. Through the splintered hole, the face watched him. It was a blank canvas of horror, a smooth, wet, pearlescent surface where features should have been. There were no eyes, yet he felt profoundly seen, catalogued not as a person, but as a piece of meat. The rain and wind tore through the opening, a chaotic invasion of the elements. But all Elias could focus on was that terrible, placid face. There was no thought. There was only the hot glass of the lamp in his hand, and the primal, reptilian instinct to survive. His movements were a blur, a frantic ballet of desperation. He twisted the cap off the lamp's oil reservoir, the metal biting into his palm. Kerosene, pungent and sharp, sloshed onto his hand and onto the floor. He did not care. He shoved the strip of velvet he had torn from the curtain into the opening, his fingers clumsy and slick with fuel. The thing in the wall began to move, a long stick-like arm slick with rain and mud snaked through the jagged opening. It moved with a disturbing fluidity, like a boneless tentacle. The end of it was not a hand, it was a single, tapered point of chitinous-looking bone, black and sharp as obsidian. It reached for him. Elias stumbled backward, towards the hearth. The heat of the fire licked at his back. He held the lamp like a club, the cloth wick hanging limp. He dipped the end of the fabric into the roaring flames. It ignited with a hungry whoosh. A ball of orange fire erupted in his hand, climbing the cloth, threatening to engulf the lamp itself. The heat was immense. He had seconds. The creature's arm was halfway into the room now, its sharpened tip probing the air, seeking him. He could smell it, a rank, loamy odor of river-bottom decay and something metallic, like stagnant water that had soaked through a bed of rusted nails. He acted. He was not an archivist anymore. He was a cornered animal, with a raw-throated yell that was more pain than fury. He swung the burning lamp in a high, desperate arc. It flew through the air, a comet of glass and fire, and smashed directly into the hole in the wall. The impact was an explosion of light and sound. The glass shattered, spraying ignited kerosene everywhere. The creature's pale face was instantly engulfed in a sheet of liquid fire. The sound it made was not a scream. A scream would have been blessedly human. This was a shriek that was not a shriek. A high-frequency, metallic screech, like the sound of a train's wheels grinding on a track, but organic and full of agony. It was the sound of steam escaping a cracked boiler, of tearing metal, of a whistle blown so hard it shattered. The sound drilled into Elias's skull, making him stagger back, his hands clamped over his ears. Through the hole, he saw a vision from hell. The creature, wreathed in flames, thrashed and convulsed. Its pale, smooth skin blackened and split, peeling back to reveal a layer of something dark and wet beneath. The oily ichor that coated it seemed to sizzle and burn, running in fiery rivulets down its body. It clawed at its own burning head with its other impossibly long arm, its sharp tip gouging deep, smoking furrows in its own flesh. The whistling from outside, the chorus that had been a constant pressure on the house, stopped. It was replaced by the single deafening screech of the burning creature. Then 2 other shapes appeared in the darkness behind it. The other gutter men moved with a new, frantic energy. They grabbed their burning companion, their own limbs smoking and sizzling where they touched the flames, and dragged it back from the house. The screeching faded as they pulled it away, a column of greasy black smoke rising into the ceaseless rain before being beaten back down to the mud. They retreated, dragging their wounded, a terrifying trio of monsters disappearing into the black moor of the woods. Silence. The only sounds were the roaring fire in the hearth, the drumming of the rain, and the ragged, painful rasp of Elias's own breathing. Wind and water blasted through the breach in the wall, scattering leaves and mud across the floorboards. The room was suddenly, shockingly cold. Elias stood, trembling, in the center of the room. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene, of wet plaster, and the unholy, sickeningly sweet scent of whatever he had just set on fire. He doubled over, his stomach heaving, and was violently sick on the floor. When the retching subsided, he was left on his hands and knees, shivering uncontrollably. He had done it. He had fought back. He had won. But it felt like no victory. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean by a terror so profound, it had burned away everything else. He could not stay like this. The hole, the gaping, ugly wound in the side of his sanctuary. He had driven them back. But for how long? His great-uncle's words came back to him. They learn. They had lack. They had learned that he was not helpless prey. They had learned about fire. What would they try next? He forced himself to his feet, his muscles screaming. He had to block the hole. He looked around the room, his eyes falling on the heaviest piece of furniture he owned, the solid oak desk in the study. It was a monumental task. He wrestled the desk out of the study, its legs gouging deep scars in the wooden floor. He grunted and strained, his breath coming in ragged pants, his muscles burning with an effort born of pure fear. He finally managed to shove it broadside against the hole, its heavy, solid mass a makeshift barricade. It did not seal the opening completely. Wind and rain still whistled through the gaps, but it was a barrier. It was something. It was not enough. He dragged the largest bookshelf from the living room wall, the books tumbling to the floor in a dusty cascade, and wedged it against the desk. He piled the fallen books on top, adding their weight to the barricade. He worked like a man possessed, his movements frantic and clumsy, driven by the image of that smooth, burning face. He snatched up the picture that had fallen, the one of a ship at sea, and wedged its frame into a gap. He grabbed the shattered remains of the plaster and shoved them into the cracks. When he was done, he stood back, panting, covered in sweat, dust, and grime. A monstrous, ugly pile of his own belongings formed a new wall where the old one had been breached. It was a testament to his terror. He sank into the armchair, his body finally giving out. The fire was burning low. He mechanically added another log, the familiar action a small comfort in the chaos. He watched the flames lick at the fresh wood. Fire was his friend. It was his only weapon. He looked at the remaining lamps on the mantelpiece, an arsenal. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that was almost a physical pain. But he could not rest. He stood up and began to pace the confines of the living room, a caged animal in a cage of his own making. He checked his defenses. The salt lines were still intact, though some had been spattered with mud from the breach. He carefully scooped up salt from the pouch and reinforced the lines at the front and back doors, his eyes constantly darting towards the windows. The world outside was black. He could see nothing beyond the reflection of his own pale, terrified face in the glass. The whistling had not returned. The silence was unnerving. Were they gone? Had he driven them away for good? He knew the answer. No, they were just thinking, learning, and then he heard it again. Thump, 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 the dripping inside the walls. It had been there all along, a quiet, insidious metronome counting down to his doom, but he had been too consumed by the direct assault to notice. Now, in the relative quiet, it was maddeningly loud. It was not coming from the study anymore. It seemed to be coming from above. He tilted his head, listening. It was in the ceiling, a slow, heavy, viscous dripping sound, right over his head. He looked up at the plaster ceiling. A dark, circular stain was spreading there, like a hideous, blooming flower. It was the size of a dinner plate, and it was growing. As he watched, a single thick, dark drop of liquid, the color of crude oil, gathered at the center of the stain, hung there for a moment, and then fell, landing on the worn rug with a soft, wet splat. The ichor, the greasy, foul substance the minister had written about. It was seeping through the ceiling. How? His eyes darted to the fireplace, the chimney. It ran up through the center of the house, through the second floor, and out the roof. A direct, vertical line from the outside world into the very heart of his home. A highway for his tormentors. They were on the roof. They had been on the roof all along, while their brethren attacked the walls. A coordinated assault. He grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, his only real weapon besides the fire itself. He stared at the fireplace opening, at the roaring flames. His great-uncle had bricked up the cellar windows. He had bolted the doors and windows on the ground floor. But what about the chimney? There was no way to seal it. It was a gaping vulnerability. He thought of the children's story, a dark, twisted version of it. Not a jolly man in a red suit, but long, thin, mud-caked things, slithering down the brickwork, their sharp limbs finding purchase in the soot and mortar. The dripping from the ceiling quickened. Splat, splat, splat. Several more dark stains appeared, small islands in the plaster sea, all connected to the chimney breast. The ichor was corrosive. He remembered the minister's words. It does not wash away. Maybe it did more than that. Maybe it ate through things. Wood, plaster, mortar. A new sound joined the dripping. A faint, dry, scraping sound. It was coming from inside the chimney. Elias froze, the poker held tight in his white-knuckled grip. He stopped breathing. He listened. It was the sound of something sharp and hard scraping against brick. It was methodical, unhurried, and it was moving downwards. He backed away from the fireplace, his eyes wide with a fresh, undiluted horror. He had barricaded the walls. He had laid his lines of salt. He had fought them back with fire. But he had sealed himself on the ground floor of a 2-story house, and the monsters were coming down the chimney. The fire in the hearth was a living thing, a hungry beast chewing on the logs he had fed it. It was his only guardian against the thing in the chimney. The scraping was louder now, closer, a rhythmic, patient sound. Scrape, pause, scrape. It was the sound of something deliberately working its way down, its sharp claws or limbs digging into the mortar between the bricks, testing its hold before descending further. Elias backed away until his shoulders hit the far wall. The poker in his hand felt like a child's toy. He was a man with a stick standing before the jaws of a dragon's den. Soot and small chunks of creosote began to fall from the flue, hissing as they landed in the flames. A prelude, an appetizer for the main course. He could not wait for it to emerge. He could not stand there and watch as it crawled out of the fire, black and slick and terrible. He had to act. He had to feed the beast in the hearth to make it so hot, so violent, that nothing could survive its throat. His eyes fell on the remaining oil lamps on the mantelpiece. An arsenal. The thought came again, but this time it was not just an idea, it was a plan. A terrible, desperate, final plan. He lunged for the mantel, grabbing the fullest, heaviest lamp. The scraping in the chimney stopped. It knew. It had heard his sudden movement. It was listening, waiting. The silence was worse than the noise. The dripping from the ceiling continued its steady, wet rhythm. A dozen dark circles now staining the plaster. But the thing in the chimney was holding its breath. Elias's hands were slick with sweat. He fumbled with the lamp's cap, his fingers refusing to grip the smooth brass. He finally twisted it free. The smell of kerosene once again sharp and clean in the smoky air. This was it. There would be no turning back from this. He was about to pour fuel on a fire inside his own house, a wooden box soaked by weeks of rain. As he lifted the heavy lamp, a new sound shattered the silence. Crash. It came from the bay window, the sound of glass shattering, a violent, explosive noise that made Elias cry out and spin around. One of the small upper panes of the window, high above the salt line, was gone. In its place was a black, jagged hole. Even as he watched, a long, thin, stick-like arm, identical to the one he had seen before, reached through the broken pane. It was not trying to get in. It was holding a rock. It dropped the rock, which thudded onto the floor inside and retracted. Crash. Another pane shattered. Then a third. It was the other two creatures. They were outside, methodically breaking every window they could reach, creating openings. A distraction? Or were they preparing for something else? They had learned about fire. Had they also learned about salt? That it only protected the thresholds, the points of entry. They were making new ones. The scraping in the chimney started again, faster this time, more urgent. It knew he was distracted. It was taking its chance. Elias was caught between two threats: a breach in the walls and an invasion from the heart of the house itself. His mind screamed. He could not fight them on two fronts. He had to choose. He chose the fire. He turned his back on the sound of breaking glass. He ignored the cold, wet wind now gusting into the room. He faced the hearth, the heavy, uncapped lamp held in both hands. Soot was raining down into the flames now, a steady black shower. It was close. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of smoke and fear and kerosene. And then he saw it. For a single, heart-stopping second, a shape appeared in the column of smoke rising from the fire. A limb, a long, impossibly thin leg, ending in that same needle-sharp point, probed down from the darkness of the flue. It was black with soot, glistening with moisture. It hovered just above the licking tips of the flames, testing the heat, the updraft. The point of it twitched, like the antenna of some colossal insect. There was no more time. With a guttural roar, Elias swung the lamp forward, not throwing it, but upending it, pouring its entire contents directly into the back of the fireplace. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. A gallon of kerosene hit the burning logs and vaporized. The fire did not grow, it detonated. A concussive, roaring fume erupted from the hearth, a solid-looking ball of orange and blue flame that blasted up the chimney with the force of a cannon. The entire house shook. The sound was a physical blow, a deep, deafening roar that vibrated in his bones, in his teeth. And above the roar came the shriek. It was the same metallic, soul-shredding sound he had heard from the burning creature outside, but magnified 100 times by the enclosed brick throat of the chimney. It was a sound of pure boiling agony, a sound that should not exist in nature. It went on, rising in pitch until it was beyond the range of hearing. Yet he could still feel it, a painful, ultrasonic pressure inside his skull. A geyser of black, oily smoke and incandescent embers shot out of the fireplace, billowing into the room. The heat was like a physical wall, forcing him back, scorching his face and hands. The makeshift barricade against the far wall caught fire, the old dry books and the ship picture igniting instantly. Flames began to lick up the wallpaper around the chimney breast. The house was on fire. He was going to burn. The shriek from the chimney suddenly cut off, replaced by a series of wet, explosive cracks, like a string of firecrackers wrapped in wet meat. A horrible, gagging, liquid sound followed, and then a great, heavy weight came crashing down the flue, landing in the raging inferno with a sickening, final thump. The fire roared with renewed hunger. Outside, the sound of breaking glass had stopped. The remaining creatures were silent, stunned or horrified by the death cry of their kin. But Elias had no time for relief. The room was an oven. Thick, acrid smoke filled the air, clawing at his lungs, making his eyes stream with tears. He could not breathe. He dropped to the floor, crawling. The cooler air, a thin layer, against the floorboards. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed. The old dry wood of the house its perfect fuel. The armchair he had been sitting in was now a tower of flames. He had to get out. He had traded one death for another. He crawled towards the hallway, his lungs on fire. The salt lines. He had sealed himself in. He scrambled to the front door, his vision blurring. He used his sleeve to smear the thick white line of salt away from the threshold, breaking the seal. His mind dimly registered the sacrilege of the act. He clawed at the deadbolt, his movements clumsy and weak. The bolt slid back with a loud click. He pulled the heavy door open and fell out onto the porch, gasping and gulping at the cold, wet, clean air. The rain was a blessing, washing the soot from his face and cooling his scorched skin. He lay there for a moment on the wet porch boards, his body trembling and his mind a void. He had survived. He had actually survived. He pushed himself up, leaning against the porch railing, and looked back at his home. Smoke was pouring from the shattered windows of the living room, and a hellish orange glow pulsed within. Then he saw the roof. A torrent of thick, greasy black smoke was billowing from the top of the chimney, along with a shower of angry red sparks that the rain quickly extinguished. His eyes followed the line of the roof down. His heart stopped. On the peak of the roof, silhouetted against the stormy, night-black sky, stood the other two gutter men. They were utterly still, their long skeletal frames like macabre weather vanes. They were not looking at him. They were staring at the top of the chimney, at the smoke pouring from the pyre of their fallen companion. They were watching it burn. As Elias watched, paralyzed, one of them turned its head. The smooth, featureless face canted downwards, and although it had no eyes, he knew it was looking directly at him. It raised a long, spindly arm and pointed. Not at him. It was pointing at the second floor of the house, at his great-uncle's bedroom window. The dripping, the ichor, the sounds from above. It had not been the creature in the chimney. It had been another one. The attack on the walls, the thing in the chimney, it was all a diversion. While he had been fighting for his life on the ground floor, another one had gotten in upstairs. It had been up there this whole time, patiently waiting, dripping its filth, while its brothers tried to flush him out. He had not escaped a trap. He had fled from the frying pan and into the fire, and now the monster was still in the house. A new sound reached him over the roar of the flames and the drumming of the rain. A sound from inside the house, from the top of the stairs. It was the sound of a window being slowly, deliberately slid open. The sound was quiet, almost gentle, a stark contrast to the roaring inferno and the shrieking agony that had preceded it. It was the simple, scraping sound of wood on wood, the sound of the upstairs window sliding open. Elias stood frozen on the porch, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, his body a trembling wreck held together only by adrenaline and terror. He stared up at the dark square of the open window. The fire from below cast flickering, demonic shadows against the second-story wall, making the darkness in that window seem absolute, a patch of night that had swallowed the stars. He was caught. The burning house was behind him, a collapsing tomb of his own making. The woods were 100 yards of sucking mud away, a place of unseen horrors. And on the roof, two silent skeletal figures watched him, their featureless faces turned towards the plume of smoke that was their dead companion. A shape appeared in the open window. It was not a head. It was a limb, a long, thin, impossibly jointed leg, feeling its way out into the rain. It found the edge of the windowsill and hooked its sharp, pointed foot over. Then another leg emerged, then a torso, a slick, pale, elongated thing that seemed to pour itself through the opening like a slug. It was the creature that had been upstairs all along, the source of the dripping. It had been above him, listening to him, waiting. It began to descend the face of the house. It was not a graceful climber. It was a thing of horror, its needle-sharp limbs punching directly into the wooden siding of the house, gouging out handholds as it came. Thunk, scrape, thunk. Each impact was a violation, another wound in the dying house. It moved with a slow, deliberate patience that was more terrifying than any frantic rush. It was coming for him, and it was in no hurry. The movement seemed to stir the two figures on the roof. As one, they turned their heads from the chimney and looked down at him. Their vigil was over. One of them began to move towards the edge of the roof, its stick-like form silhouetted against the orange glow. He had to run, now. Elias lurched off the porch, his feet sinking into the cold, deep mud. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring his teeth. He pushed himself up, his hands coated in the filth of the yard, and ran. He did not run for the woods. He did not run for the road. Instinct, primal and raw, screamed at him to stay near the only thing they feared. He ran alongside the house, toward the back, keeping the towering wall of flames between him and the things that were hunting him. The heat was blistering, even through the driving rain. It pulled the air from his lungs, but it was a shield. He glanced back. The creature from the window was halfway down the wall, its eyeless face tracking his movement. The two from the roof were now clambering down the sides, moving with the same horrifying wall-puncturing method. He was being herded. He rounded the back corner of the house. The kitchen windows had been shattered, and flames were now beginning to pour out, blackening the siding. He was trapped in a narrow corridor of mud and fire. There was nowhere to go but forward, to complete the circuit and return to the front yard where they would be waiting. It was then that he noticed it, a change in the rhythm of the world. For days, the sound of the rain had been a constant, oppressive roar, a drumming that beat against the world and against his sanity. But now, it was different. It was softer. The hammering on his shoulders had become a steady, heavy patter. The roar had faded to a loud hiss. The rain was letting up. The thought was a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness of his terror. Hope. It was a foreign, almost painful feeling. He stumbled on, his lungs burning, his legs heavy as lead. He risked another look behind him. The creatures had noticed it too. Their movements were no longer patient. The one from the front of the house had dropped the last 10 feet, landing in the mud with a wet splat. The other two were scrambling down the sides with a new frantic energy. Their whistling started again, but it was different. It was not the confident hunting call from before. It was a thin, reedy, desperate sound, a sound of fear. He reached the far corner and peered around into the front yard. The first creature was already there, standing in the mud between him and the relative safety of the road. It stood, its long body swaying slightly, its head cocked as if listening to the changing rain. The other two emerged from the sides of the house, flanking it. The trio was reformed. They stood in a loose semicircle, blocking his escape. They watched him, their whistling a thin, discordant lament. The fire raged behind him, a wall of heat at his back, the house groaning as its bones began to break. It was a standoff. A man and 3 monsters in a dying garden, as the world slowly stopped weeping. He had nothing left. The poker was gone. The lamps were gone. The journal, with all its secrets, was now ash and smoke. He was weaponless, exhausted, and cornered. All he could do was watch them, and watch the sky. The rain lessened further. The patter became a drizzle. The world grew quieter, the crackle and roar of the fire becoming the dominant sound. The creatures grew more agitated. They shifted their stake like feet in the mud. Their whistling became higher, a pained, sharp note that spoke of profound distress. They looked at the sky. They looked at the wet, glistening ground. They looked at him, and for the first time, he felt something from them besides malice. He felt desperation. And then, it happened. The rain stopped. It did not taper off to nothing. It simply ceased. One moment, there was a drizzle. The next, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the hungry fire. The last drops fell from the choked leaves of the trees. The world was suddenly, shockingly still. The reaction from the creatures was immediate and horrific. The one in the center let out a final, piercing whistle that ended in a wet, gurgling pop. It shuddered, its whole body convulsing in a violent spasm. Its smooth, pale skin began to darken, turning the color of drying clay. Cracks appeared, spreading like a spider web across its featureless face. Its limbs, once fluid, became stiff and brittle. It was drying out. A low, crumbling sound came from it, the sound of desiccating earth. It tried to take a step, its leg snapping at the joint with a crack like a dead branch. It fell to its knees, its long arms pinwheeling, and then it simply came apart, collapsing into a heap of muddy, foul-smelling loam and what looked like a tangle of dried, twisted roots. The thing was not alive in the way he understood it. It was a thing of the rain, of the mud, of the wet, dark earth. And the rain was gone. The other two met the same fate. They clawed at their own bodies as the life-giving moisture left them, their sharp fingers leaving deep gouges in their hardening flesh. They staggered, their joints locking, their bodies stiffening. They fell, one after the other, and crumbled into the same elemental dust, their final, pathetic whistles absorbed by the silent, watching woods. Elias stood, swaying, unable to process what he had seen. He stared at the 3 piles of mud and sticks on his lawn. It was over. He did not know how long he stood there, watching his home burn, the flames now a cleansing, purifying force against the unnatural horror that had infested it. He was numb, a hollowed-out shell of a man. Slowly, as if in a dream, the eastern sky began to lighten. A pale, watery grey seeped into the blackness, followed by the faintest blush of pink. The storm clouds were breaking apart. A single, brilliant star shone through a gap. Sunrise. The fire had consumed most of the house now. The roof collapsed with a deafening roar and a great shower of sparks, sending a final column of smoke and ash towards the heavens. What was left was a skeleton, a blackened, smouldering ruin against the dawn. Elias turned away from the destruction of his past and looked down the muddy, rutted track towards Havenwood Creek. He looked towards the town. Silence. No sirens. No shouts. No signs of life. He was alive. He was the one who had survived to tell the tale. He looked at the clearing sky, at the promise of a new day, a day without rain. The terror was over. However, he knew, as he took the first difficult step on the long road back to whatever was left of civilization, that the horror would remain. The memory of the rain and the things that came with it would never wash away.